Story 1. I've never been a fan of big parties. Even back in college, I got tired of the whole going out culture pretty quickly. I always preferred spending time with a few close friends doing something that actually mattered to me. Growing up in northern Minnesota, my family had a New Year's tradition that most people would probably think is insane: ice fishing. My dad and his buddies would head out onto the frozen lake every year, while everyone else was celebrating the new year in the warmth of their homes. It wasn't your typical celebration, but it was ours. My mom wasn't around much, so my brother, my uncle, my dad, and I would brave the cold together, year after year. Now my dad is gone, and my brother moved to Chicago a few years ago. Still, I try to keep the tradition alive as best I can. This particular New Year's Eve, I was heading out with my two best friends, Chris and Jake. Both of them are rugged, outdoorsy types, the kind of guys who'd rather chop firewood than sit in front of a TV. They're like brothers to me, and we've been doing this fishing trip together for the past couple of years. It's not just about fishing, it's about holding on to something that feels like home. Chris was driving that night. His truck was perfect for the trip: big tires, four-wheel drive, and plenty of room in the back for our gear. We packed everything we needed: rods, bait, a sled for hauling gear, and a pop-up shelter to keep us out of the worst of the cold. The forecast called for clear skies, but in Minnesota, you learn to prepare for the worst. The lake we were heading to wasn't one you'd find on any tourist map. It was a hidden gem, surrounded by thick woods, with ice that stayed solid no matter how mild the winter. As Chris navigated the snowy backroads, the excitement built. There's something peaceful about ice fishing. Just you, your friends, and the hope of a good catch. It's a hell of a lot better than getting hammered at some bar. We pulled up near the trailhead just as the sun was setting. That's when I noticed him, a man standing near the edge of the parking area. He was bundled up in heavy winter gear, but something about him didn't feel right. He wasn't moving, just staring at us as we parked. At first, I thought he was just another fisherman, but then I saw him glance down at his phone, then back at us, over and over. It wasn't casual. "That guy's creeping me out," I muttered to Chris and Jake. Jake shrugged. "Probably just another angler." Chris nodded, but didn't say anything. We started unloading our gear, but before we could get far, the man rushed toward us, waving his arms frantically. I rolled down the window as he reached us. "Help! You gotta help me!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "My buddy fell through the ice. I just got a text from our other friend. Please, he's gonna drown." Without thinking, we all jumped out of the truck. The man took off down the trail, and we followed, leaving our coats and gear behind. His panic seemed so real, it was impossible to question. As we got closer to the lake, I noticed something strange. He wasn't leading us toward the usual fishing spots. Instead, we were heading to a more remote part of the shoreline, where the ice was notoriously thin. My gut told me something was wrong, but it was too late to stop. That's when I saw them, two men standing near the edge of the lake. They weren't dressed for fishing, and they weren't moving. They were just waiting. Both of them were armed. My heart sank as the man we'd been following turned back to face us, a smirk spreading across his face. "Don't move," one of the men barked, raising his gun. We'd been set up. The second man demanded Chris's keys and everything we had on us. Trembling, Chris tossed the keys over, and we emptied our pockets. I tried to keep my phone, but one of them noticed and made me hand it over. Chris lied, saying his phone was in the truck, and miraculously, they believed him. Within minutes, they had everything. One of them sped off in Chris's truck while the other two disappeared into the woods, presumably heading for their own vehicle. We stood there, shivering, trying to process what had just happened. Jake muttered a string of curses under his breath, while Chris kicked at a nearby tree in frustration. That's when Chris pulled out his phone. "I lied," he said with a shaky laugh, holding it up. Somehow, we still had service. He called the police, explaining everything as clearly as he could. They told us to stay put, and we huddled together for warmth while we waited. The adrenaline had worn off, and the cold was starting to seep into my bones. When the cops arrived, the snow had started falling again. They took our statements and gave us a ride back to Jake's house, which was the closest. Chris's truck was never found, and the men who robbed us were never caught. To this day, we still can't make sense of it. Jake thinks it was a crime of opportunity, that they weren't planning to rob anyone but jumped at the chance when we showed up. But I don't know. It felt too deliberate, too planned. Why else would they be out there, in the middle of nowhere, on New Year's Eve? I'll never forget the look in that guy's eyes when he turned back and smirked at us. I don't think I ever will. Story 2. What I am about to share is something that lingers in my mind every year around this time. It happened on New Year's Eve a few years ago. I was driving to my parents' house in northern Pennsylvania to ring in the new year with them. The journey was a few hours long, so I set out in the late afternoon, planning to arrive well before midnight. The plan seemed foolproof. I enjoy long drives. They give me time to think and clear my head. But that evening, the weather decided to throw a wrench in my plans. The snow started about an hour into the drive. At first, it was just light flurries, nothing concerning. The way the flakes dusted my windshield was almost peaceful. I was foolish enough to think, this is beautiful. What a perfect way to start the new year. That thought must have jinxed me because, as I continued, the snow fell heavier. Within minutes, the flurries turned into a full-blown snowstorm. The highway became a slick mess, and visibility dropped to almost nothing. My little sedan, not exactly built for winter weather, struggled on the increasingly slippery road. When the tires began losing traction even on slight inclines, I knew I had to pull over. There was no point in risking my life. I found a spot on the shoulder of the road, far enough away from passing cars. Not that there were many. Once parked, I texted my parents to let them know I was stuck. They were worried, naturally. I tried to reassure them that I would be fine, though I was not entirely convinced myself. My plan was to wait out the storm, figuring it could not last forever. But the snow only worsened, piling up around the car and blanketing the road ahead. After an hour, it became clear I was not going anywhere that night. My dad offered to come get me, but I told him that driving in those conditions was a terrible idea. Reluctantly, he agreed. I considered calling the police, but I convinced myself I could manage on my own for a bit longer. The idea of spending the night in my car unsettled me. I did not want to burn through all my gas keeping warm, and I worried about draining the battery if I left the heat or lights on too long. So, I alternated between turning the engine on and off, trying to conserve as much as possible. The isolation started to weigh on me. The wind howled outside, and the silence inside my car was deafening. That is when I noticed headlights cutting through the storm behind me. Relief washed over me as a snowplow pulled up beside my car. Finally, help had arrived. I rolled down my window, and the driver leaned out of his cab. He was an older man, probably in his late 50s. He wore a thick jacket and a black knit hat pulled low over his ears. His face was rugged and weathered, the kind you see on someone who has spent years braving harsh elements. He stared at me for a moment, longer than felt normal, before finally speaking. "You okay there?" he asked in a gruff voice that immediately struck me as unsettling. I explained that my car could not handle the conditions and that I was stuck. He nodded, his gaze briefly shifting to the back seat of my car, as if searching for something. Just as I was about to say more, he offered to give me a ride. I hesitated. He seemed genuine, but something about him made me uneasy. Still, the thought of staying in my car all night seemed just as risky, if not more so. After a moment's deliberation, I agreed. I grabbed my bag and climbed into the cab of the plow. The warmth inside was a welcome relief, and I felt my tension ease slightly as I settled into the seat. "Where are you headed?" he asked. I gave him my parents' address, and he nodded again, saying it would not be a problem. The silence that followed was not awkward, but as the minutes ticked by, I began to feel increasingly uncomfortable. That is when I noticed we were not heading in the right direction. I tried to keep my voice steady as I asked, "Are we going the right way?" Without looking at me, he replied, "Taking a detour. The back roads will be better than the highway in this storm." I did not know the area well enough to argue, but his response sent a chill down my spine. I glanced around the cab, hoping to calm my nerves, but what I saw only heightened my fear. Empty liquor bottles rolled on the floor near his feet. Torn maps were stuffed into the side pockets, and a large knife was wedged between the seats. My heart pounded as I realized something was very wrong. The GPS on my phone kept recalibrating, trying to redirect us back on course, but he ignored it entirely. Panic set in as we continued down unfamiliar roads. Then, I spotted a house in the distance. It was the first sign of civilization I had seen in miles. Summoning all my courage, I waited until we were close, grabbed the door handle, and shoved it open. Cold air rushed in as I tumbled out into the snow, landing hard and feeling a sharp pain in my leg. I scrambled to my feet and bolted toward the house, the man shouting behind me. I pounded on the door, screaming for help. A couple opened it and quickly pulled me inside. I collapsed onto their floor, trying to catch my breath as I explained what had happened. Without hesitation, they called the police. By the time officers arrived, the snowplow and its driver were long gone. They assured me they would search the area, but with the storm raging, finding him was unlikely. The couple offered me a ride to my parents' house and even helped arrange for a tow truck to retrieve my car. I was beyond grateful for their kindness. When I finally reached my parents' house, my dad was furious and terrified in equal measure. I have not driven in the snow since that night, and I often think about what could have happened if I had stayed in that plow. It is a memory I will never forget. Story 3. This happened on New Year's Eve back in 2017. I am from Ohio, just outside of Cleveland, and I was flying home after finishing up a semester at the University of Rochester. Unfortunately, I had to stay at school for an extra week after the semester ended due to personal reasons, so I ended up spending Christmas relatively alone. The flight itself was uneventful, but I was already in a sour mood before I even boarded the plane. I am a lifelong Cleveland Browns fan, and as I waited at the airport, the Browns lost their final game of the regular season, completing a dismal 0-16 record. That special kind of misery hit hard. To top it off, my flight was delayed, which derailed my family's plans for the evening. Originally, we were supposed to drive together to my cousin's house for a New Year's Eve party and spend the night there, but because of the delay, my parents decided to leave early, taking the main car. This left me driving the spare car by myself. My mom tried to make it up to me by leaving our golden retriever, Vera, behind to keep me company. I was not thrilled about making the trip solo, but Vera was always good company. I figured I would make the best of it. By the time my Uber dropped me off from the airport, it was creeping up on 10 p.m. I did not even bother unpacking. I just threw all my stuff into the car, grabbed Vera, locked up the house, and hit the road. The drive itself was nothing special, just miles of Ohio back roads winding through empty fields and patches of forest. There was only a light dusting of snow on the ground, which was a relief since I hated driving in heavy snow. It was pitch black, and the only light came from my car's headlights and the occasional farmhouse with its porch light glowing faintly in the distance. About halfway into the trip, Vera started whining. At first, I thought she just wanted attention, but then she stood up and began pacing in the passenger seat. That's when I realized she needed to go to the bathroom. I groaned, knowing I had no choice but to pull over. The next clearing I came across was small, barely enough space for the car, but it would have to do. Stepping out of the car, I immediately noticed how dark it was. If not for the patches of white snow here and there, I probably would not have been able to see into the woods at all. I jammed my hands into my pockets, trying my best not to freeze, while Vera hopped out and sniffed around the edge of the trees. I did not bother leashing her. She was a well-behaved dog and never wandered far. As she took her time, I suddenly heard a loud crashing sound coming from somewhere in the woods. It was not just a branch breaking. It sounded heavier and deliberate, like something, or someone, was moving through the trees. The sound was so loud that I literally jumped. Imagine a grown man sprinting through the forest. That is genuinely what it sounded like. I squinted into the darkness, trying to make out anything beyond the first few trees, but it was too dark. Before I could react, Vera bolted directly into the woods. My heart sank. She disappeared into the trees so quickly that I lost sight of her in mere seconds. I started yelling her name over and over, but she did not come back. My chest tightened with panic. I could not just leave her out there. Without thinking, I ran into the woods, blindly calling out for her. The adrenaline took over as I sprinted through the darkness, guided only by my dim phone flashlight and the thin layer of snow on the ground. I kept running, praying I would find her before she got to whatever was out there. After what felt like forever, my lungs gave out from the cold, forcing me to stop. I leaned against a tree, on the verge of breaking down, when I finally saw her. Vera was crouched low and shivering, walking slowly toward me with her tail tucked tightly between her legs. I dropped to my knees and hugged her, relief flooding through me. She pressed against me, trembling. Whatever she had encountered had terrified her. That's when I snapped back to reality. We were still in the middle of the woods, and whatever had scared Vera was still out there. I stood up and told her to follow me. This time, she obeyed and stuck close to my side. I had no idea if we were going the right way, but I had to try. Then, I heard it again, crashing noises behind us. My blood turned to ice. This time, the sound seemed to be following us. I did not think. I just started running, with Vera darting ahead of me. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. The crashing continued, growing louder and closer. By some miracle, Vera led me straight back to the car. I threw her inside and slammed the door shut. As I jumped into the driver's seat, I glanced back toward the woods and froze. At the edge of the trees stood 3 figures, watching us. My stomach dropped. I jammed the keys into the ignition and floored it, speeding away without looking back. My hands were trembling, and my thoughts were racing. It was not until I had driven several miles that I noticed Vera was bleeding. Panic set in as I realized she had a cut just below her shoulder blade. Someone, or something, had hurt her. I slammed on the brakes, rushed to the trunk, and grabbed the first aid kit my mom always kept in the car. For once, her insistence on being overly prepared paid off. I cleaned Vera's wound as best as I could and wrapped it in gauze. She whimpered, and I hated that I was causing her pain, but I knew it had to be done. For the first time since the ordeal began, I felt a small sense of relief. The rest of the drive was a blur. I could not stop replaying everything in my head, trying to make sense of it. I ended up not telling my parents or relatives about what had happened. To this day, I am not sure why. Maybe it felt too unreal, or maybe it was something I just wanted to keep to myself. Whatever it was, that night will stay with me forever.